This is the true history of the pirate Farley, with a factual account of the disappearance of his cat-rigged boat. Part 1. Says I, there was once an old fellow I knew. Long beard, friendly eyes, nice and mellow, it's true. But his house was run down, and he lived outside town, here in Dockside, a place that most people avoid. An old sailor he was, now confined to the shore. He'd no family, no money, his life was a chore. But if asked, he would say he was waiting. One day he still hoped that his daughter would come for him here. He was off, it was true, and his eyes, which were blue, watched the waves with a longing that filled them with dew. For a sailor on land is but half of a man, who will never lie easy till sailing again. Well, the sidewalks are crumbling, the houses are tumbling down, as you see. And the man's house, though once a renowned old hotel, was decrepit, abandoned except that this sailor was squatting there, him and his cats. See, the man had a navy of cats living there. That old place was just bursting with fur everywhere. On the roof, on the lawn, on the porch, dusk till dawn, every window and door was a bed for a cat. There were orange ones, black ones, white, tabby, and gray. He would fish for 'em, couldn't buy food, couldn't pay. So he'd get up each day and walk down to the bay with a bucket of bait, and he'd catch them their dinner. Now, the man missed the sea, all the salt, sun, and air, so he got him a boat, little thing, parked it there by the side of the dock. He would go there and rock in the evenings, just rock while he looked out to sea. It was battered and broken, that tatty old boat. If you'd seen it, you'd know that the thing wouldn't float. But the man loved that wreck, liked the feel of the deck 'neath his feet. So he went there one day and the next. Now, those cats loved that man, so they'd sit there and howl till it rattled your bones. Oh, they'd growl and they'd yowl at the foot of the ladder, getting hoarser and sadder till they'd mope their way back to that run-down hotel. But one evening, things changed. The old man, as he sat with his pipe, lost in thought, was surprised by a cat, who came sauntering slowly, casually, knowingly, weaving her way past the mast to the wheel. Now, this lissom young gray, with a ring round her tail, leapt the cockpit's cracked combing, came back to the rail. With her cat's sly, shy grin, she rubbed up on his shin, till he lifted her into his lap with a smile. How she got there he never found out, never cared. He was glad for the company, glad as he stared at the sunsetting sea for the warmth on his knee, and the warmth in his heart that his little bit brought. That's the name that he gave her, his own little bit. Every day she would curl in his lap, or she'd sit on the rail by his side, as he softly confided to her all the longings and fears of his heart. He was old and depressed, but some part of him knew who that little bit was. I'm convinced that it's true, for the way that she pressed her whole head to his chest was just like her. Like Leah, his wife, now long gone. Oh, he would tell little bit of his venturesome youth, how being raised on a ship he'd been rude and uncouth, but he'd sailed round the Horn, lived through battles and storms, and his mates named him captain before he could shave. Now, this captain... Oh, hell, I'll just tell you his name. It's not secret. There's nobody going to blame me for letting it out. Name was Farley. I doubt that you've heard of him. Sailors, though, ask them, they'll know. As a captain, he'd sailed round the world many times. He'd been shipwrecked on islands, resisted the rhymes of the mermaids whose songs fill all sailors with longings that drive them insane. But not him. He was tough. He was strong. He'd had scurvy and lice. He'd had boils and sores. He'd been shot at and cussed out and cursed and abhorred. But he kept to the seas, to the skies without trees, for he'd never found something to keep him ashore. But it happened one day that his ship went astray in a storm. We sought shelter, sailed into the bay of an island unknown to him. Maps that were shown to him didn't record the isle's shape or location. But the isle was substantial, no phantom or ghost. As we sailed past the cliffs of the isle's outer coast, the winds died in the lees, and the beaches and trees caught our eyes with a beauty I ruin. Of a sudden the gales were forgotten. The rails were soon lined with those men who had tended the sails only moments before. Now our eyes swept the shore as though each of us hoped to spy treasure or gold. When the storm had receded, we let down a boat, and good Farley stepped down in his most formal coat. Every man snatched his oar, and we pulled for the shore so abruptly the captain was forced to sit down. Oh, the bay's beaches were black, and all backed by such trees as we none of us ever had seen. As we eased on to sand, dark and hot from the sun, every one of us felt something change in our hearts and our minds. Well, we stood on the beach as though lost in a daze, and we watched as the surf arced its way round the bay. There was something that held us beneath the sun's rays as the metronome surf whispered stop, murmured stay. Now, we all were transfixed by the circling waves, and we stood on the beach with our backs to the isle, so we none of us saw them or heard. And it gave us a start when we turned and faced 20 young men. They were armed, but their weapons weren't drawn. On their faces were looks that we couldn't quite read. Without speaking, they motioned for us to come forward. We braced for a fight, but they turned and went into the trees. Feeling foolish, we stood for a moment, and then there was nothing to do but pursue them. So that's what we did. Well, we passed through a tangle of low-hanging vines and came into a place unlike any we'd known. There was something, well, more than alive. Undefined but ubiquitous, shaping the plants and the stones. There were tree ferns with fronds that were woven in braids. There were elegant mushrooms on long, slender stalks. There were rainbows of green, brooding olives, bright jades, and a smell like burnt cinnamon rose where we walked. As we followed our guides, the isle's wonders increased. There were insects whose colors would change as they flew, gentle bees that were red as they droned through the trees, when descending to flowers, turned purple, then blue. We passed under a cliff that was covered with webs, which held diamonds of dew from a waterfall mist. There were dragonflies floating on drafts overhead. On their backs rode small creatures that chittered and hissed. Oh, at a mangrove, we walked on a boardwalk of sticks that were woven together and hammock-like hung from great tupelo trees. I was sure that rickety thing would collapse, but it didn't. It swung to our steps, but it carried us over the bogs, through a stand of fat cattails and into a dell where the trees were alive with strange, colorful frogs that had wings. As we passed, they took flight, all pell-mell. We passed rivers and meadows and came to a hill where we climbed out of trees into sunlight and wind. All around us, the isle's verdant beauty lay still, like a green living blanket, protecting and kind. Now before us, atop the hill's crest, was a scene. There were pennants, pavilions, long tables of food, and we sailors came forward all lost in a dream, like somnambulist children. We gawked where we stood. But we came round the tents and then onto a field where a great host of people were gathered in rows. At the front of the group was a platform where kneeled a young couple in garlands and ritual clothes. 'Twas a wedding in progress. 2 youths of the isle had just started exchanging their vows. Oh, but now they looked up at us sailors. We awkwardly smiled, lamely waved or saluted or jerkily bowed. The isle's king, looking livid, stood up and came round with his guards. There was violence in some of their eyes. In a flash, Captain Farley drew sword with a sound that was menacing. All of us froze. Some child cried. But instead of attacking and shouting, "You curs," Captain Farley laid sword on the ground and then bowed. "Please excuse our discourteous presence, good sir. I assure you we meant no offense. This I vow." There was silence. Then Farley's whole crew did the same as their captain had done. We laid down all our weapons, and Farley, with grace, swept his hat from his mane, saying, "Please, let the service continue. We're tame." The king smiled at his words, and the danger was past. He stepped forward to Farley and put out his hand. "We suspected that pirates belonged to the masts that sailed into our bay unforeseen, without leave. By your look you're a sea dog, but looks can deceive. By your words you have humor and honor and grace. May I ask you to wait for me here? Please don't leave. I would talk with you after the wedding takes place." The king spun on his heel and returned to his throne, and the crowd turned to face the young couple again. All but one. By the king, near an ancient old crone, sat a woman who gazed at us new-arrived men. From politeness or no, from self-consciousness, Farley did not meet the gaze of this woman at first. He looked up to the altar, then down to his frayed and discolored old coat. All embarrassed, he cursed. Now, I never had seen Captain Farley like this. Oh, I'd seen him round women, but they were the ones who got nervous, not him. I had seen him dismiss the most beautiful women as though they were nuns. See, no woman had ever commanded his heart, and strong Farley conceived of himself as immune. But this Leah, with eyes that were lovely and dark, in a moment had altered his world, changed his tune. When some time had gone by, Farley looked up again. I could see he was lost right away, for he gazed with a longing that's not of this world. And then, when Leah turned, he continued to stare, all amazed. I was there, and I saw, but I can't now explain. See, her eyes, they were depthless and lovely and strange. When she looked at you, well, it was pleasure like pain, or a feeling like sunshine that follows long rain. She was looking at Farley, and I confess that an unwanted envy arose in my heart. But my love for my captain was strong, and, distressed by my feelings, I turned and walked off, stood apart. Now, I probably should tell you I owed him my life. Captain Farley had saved me one day years before. I'd been pressed into working a ship called the Knife, and a galley it was, with 2 long banks of oars. See, I was orphaned at birth and brought up in a place that was less than a home, leave it there. When the master came in with the press gang, our faces lit up at the prospect of leaving. I swear there were boys that ran forward and fought for the chance to embark with these men we had none of us met. But the master beat most of them back. He advanced through the mob, picking healthy ones, told us to get all our things to depart, which we did. Then they steered us through town to the shipyards, and we cheered. We were thrilled to be out in the air. We'd no fear. We'd escaped, and we happily raced down the pier. But as soon as the galley pulled out from the quay, out came leg chains and lashes, and then there was nothing to do. We were slaves, and we wouldn't be free until Farley released us. 3 years. It was tough. It was hell. We were fed just enough to keep strength in us. Animals, that's what we were to them. Beasts who could row. And the pirates were ruthless. They used the same plan every time. First the grape from the cannon to mow down defenders on deck. Then we rowers were whipped till the knife was just tearing its way toward the target. Our battering ram punched a hole in the ship, then they boarded and took it. We'd hear from afar. Well, the Knife didn't have room for no prisoners, so none were required. The plunder was taken aboard, then the ships were set fire. Every one was sent under. No quarter. Those pirates were cruel to their core. But their luck ran aground when they fell in the snare of good Farley. The day was a stagnant one. Stillness prevailed everywhere, in the sea, in the air, and the pirates were slavering mad for a kill. They were hot, they were mean, they'd been days without prey. So when finally they sighted a ship, they all cheered. Then they brutally whipped us poor slaves, till the spray from our bow arced out wide. Very quickly we neared Farley's ship. 'Twas in irons, so the pirates expected to take her with ease. Through their glass they saw fear. Men were shouting and running, their duties neglected. They'd seen us approaching. Our galley was clearly preparing to take them. They knew it, and panic had seized them. Their decks were in chaos, or so it appeared. Things were tossed overboard, and a man leapt off, screaming. A shot rang out. Then from below came a figure who looked like their captain. He ordered some men to let down a small boat. They rowed round to the front of the ship and began, using cords that ran back to the bow, to change course. It astounded the pirates to see that the ship was not turning to fight. It was trying to flee. With the rowboat, the fools slowly pulled their ship round, so the stern was toward us. Well, the pirates, they jeered and they crowed. Oh, the doomed ship moved so ponderously slow, there was barely a wake, and we swept toward them, hawks to the kill. We could see they were desperate and close to despair. Frenzied crew cast their stores overboard. Still, they were trying to lighten their load. It was futile. In minutes we'd come into range and the slaughter would start. So the pirates prepared for their brutal assault. Out came pistols and swords. In the water between our two ships was the jetsam, the casks and the crates they'd discarded. The pirates ignored this debris. They were bent to the task of preparing their cannon. And so as we oared our way in toward their ship, we came into a field of their refuse. It floated around us, encircling the Knife. But the danger was so well concealed that the pirates, oblivious, kept to their work, unaware that their galley had entered a trap. They were loading the cannon with grape when suddenly shots rang out. Pirates fell overboard, slapping the water and screaming. Confusion and blood. It was chaos. A pirate crashed down on the oars just in front of me, blood pouring out of his leg. He was cursing and struggling to rise, but before he could get to his feet, he was clubbed by Big Greg. He collapsed in a heap, and Big Greg looked around at the rest of us slaves. "Now's our chance," he barked out. Then he lifted his oar, and although he was bound at the ankles, he swung it above him and shouted for us to rebel. But a brute from the walk up above shot him down. He just crumpled on top of the pirate, while all of us, well, we just gawked. "Is there any more filth down there wanting a pop from my friend here?" the demon was screaming. "Sit still where you are." Then he turned and ran up to the bow. Well, we couldn't just sit there. Big Greg had been killed, and we filled with a rage that our curses and vows couldn't quench. We all raised up our oars and we swung at the pirates above. But just then, through my oar door, a grapnel hook flew. Well, it hooked on a rung of a ladder, but when it came taut, it just tore itself free, and it would have gone overboard, but... Well, I don't like to brag, but I grabbed at the rope, and I wrapped it around my oar's thole, which jut up from the gunwale. I sure didn't know, but I hoped that whoever was out there would free us, and so I held firm to the rope and secured it. Directly, good Farley's fierce mien was before me. Now, though I had never before seen his face, he projected a kind of it was kindness and strength. I reached out and I pulled him aboard. With a nod, he pushed past me. He crouched and he ran down the whole length of the galley. Then, quick as a wink, he rode roughshod on all that remained of the pirates. He leapt at the two in the stern who were shooting at men in the water. He snatched up an oar and just swept those men off of the deck. Then he pulled out a slender stiletto and turned. On the walkway, another foul rogue was approaching. His sword was far longer than Farley's small knife, and he smiled. "My brother," he shouted, "I'll kill you for sport. To prolong your sweet pain, I will take—" But his words were cut off. The stiletto was there in his gut. With a groan, he slumped down, saying something unheard. He reached up for a moment, then fell, his eyes shut to the world. Now, the last of his mates gave a roar and stepped over his body toward Farley, who now was defenseless. The pirate came slow, and he swore he would take Farley with him to hell. With a vow to the devil, he threw off his pistol and drew from his baldric a long, lethal saber, all rusty and notched from great use. Farley backed, for he knew he'd no chance while unarmed. He stepped back and adjusted his footing. It looked like he might leap back into the sea. But right then, the man seated just next to Big Greg lifted up brave Greg's oar. With a spin and a shout he let fly, and brave Farley, with reflexes faster than those of a cat, leapt to catch the flung oar. He came down with it held like a staff and spun round. He was armed now, and more than a match for the brute with the sword. Well, we cheered. Farley laughed, and he shouted across to the swine, "This brave crew seems to want a new leader." We leapt up with, "Aye, aye!" Oh, then another oar, thrown like a javelin, flew from below. It was Skay, a young man with one eye that was blue and another 'twas gray. He was gruff, and he suffered no fools, but we all had respect for him. More after this, for his strike was enough to disarm the foul fiend, who had never suspected a blow from the side. His long saber fell clattering down, and he stood there, unarmed and quite clearly afraid. Well, we roared, and we stomped, and we spat at the devil, till Farley called out for our jeering to stop. In the silence that followed, the eyes of the devil shot round in a panic. "That's right," said good Farley. "You're faced with a choice. Now a wise man would jump while he could, but a proud fool, he'd fight. Either way, in the end, you'll be overboard. So you can leap on your own and swim off, or remain there and wait till I've beaten you senseless. I know it's a difficult choice, so I'll give your slow brain a few moments to think the thing through." We laughed, and that pirate sneered round at us hatefully. But in the end, he leapt awkwardly off of his craft and swam clumsily out toward his fate in the indifferent sea. Well, we brought round the knife, and we rafted our galley to Farley's tall ship. They brought axes and saws, and in moments our chains were cast off. We were free. It was then, well, they say I came in through the hawse hole. It means I enlisted at sea. See, our ships were tied up for 3 days while we made our repairs, and good Farley, well, how to explain? He equipped us with weapons, provisions, and tools. He declared that the knife was now ours, and when one of his crew raised a voice in complaint, saying he hadn't signed on for charity's sake, Farley took him and threw him straight into the sea. Then he calmly reminded the man that their ship was in irons when our galley approached, that their trap would have failed if they hadn't had help from us slaves. We'd been brave. We had rallied around them and fought with them. And, Farley added, their losses were more than our own. We lost 2, they lost 3. So to even things out, perhaps we should just sacrifice you. There was silence. A few of us shifted on deck, but the man made no plea. He just flailed in the water and waited for Farley's pronouncement. It didn't come quick, but eventually Farley called down, "You can stay where you are if you like, but we'd rather you climbed up and went back to work. You have carried your weight, you're an asset, you see, and so letting you up, that's not charity. No, you have worth, it's your due." Then he cast down a rope and the man climbed aboard. He'd been scared, but his treatment was fair. That was Farley. He came off as cruel at first, but in truth he was kind. Well, but more. He was noble. He could have laid claim to the knife, could have sold it. And us. Bear in mind, we were slaves, still in chains when he captured the knife. But he freed us, allowed us to name our own Skay as our captain. And Well, I thought of my life, and I found I was ripe for a change. I could stay on the knife, now in freedom, but still at the oar. I could find some small port, disembark, and then what? I'd no trade, I'd no skills. I began to explore an alternative plan. Well, I kept my mouth shut. As they say, it is simpler to ask for forgiveness. Permission's much harder to win. So I planned and I waited. And when the wind came and they divvied the duties to cast off the knife, well, I manned the last spring line, and as the ships parted, I leapt. Yes, I leapt off the knife, and I swung out and thumped against the side of the larger ship's hull. But I kept my tight grip, and I climbed to the rail and then jumped to the deck. Well, the men that surrounded me looked like they'd just as well kill me as ask me to stay. But then Farley came up, and he took a good look at me, smiled, and declared I was welcome. He lay a kind hand on my shoulder. I'm sure he remembered that I was the one who had helped him, and turned to his men, who looked doubtful. "We lost our man Chemmers, I hope you'll recall, so before you all spurn this bold soul, let me ask which of you will replace him and live in the yards?" There was silence. "All right, then. I want you to welcome him. Find him a space down below and then show him aloft. Now, you're tied for a half of a share till you've proved yourself. Fair?" Well, I hadn't a clue what that meant, but it seemed he was letting me stay. So I nodded. And there, In that moment, my life changed forever. My dreams of becoming a man of my own were made good, and I owe it to Farley. He gave me a chance. And the months I spent up in the rigging were rough, but I wouldn't exchange them for anything. Up in the sun and the wind and the rain, I became who I am. I worked hard, and it wasn't so long before I was accepted. For once in my life, I had family. Food and a hammock, a ship, and a sky that was star-blown with promises, wind-swept with purpose, and beautiful, beautiful. Farley, he gave me, well, hell, he had given me life. If it weren't for him, I'd have died on that galley a slave. I loved him. So when we came on to that uncharted island and Farley was taken with Leah, although I was also enchanted, my heart told me go, walk away. And I did, so that he was alone when their eyes met. I stood to one side and I watched as she boldly stared back at my captain. At first he was timid, my captain. She eyed him intensely with wonder and fear. In her lap, her strange cat also stared, as though she were assessing good Farley as well. And at first he looked down, too confused or embarrassed to meet this aggressive appraisal. But then he looked up with a frown. He was clearly determined to meet the girl's gaze, and he did. But his frown quickly melted. His eyebrows unknit, his dark eyes lighted up with a blaze, and his lips, well, they parted and let out a sigh. The inscrutable depth of her eyes drew him in. There was beauty and sorrow and mystery there. He was lost. He was found. And the fire that kindled between them would never go out. They'd been paired long before they had met. I'm convinced it was fated. Her cat saw it too. You could tell by the way it meowed as it looked back and forth. It had rated good Farley a match. Then it scampered away, for the wedding was over, and people were standing and clearing a path, and the newlyweds made their way down through the crowd toward the shore, hand in hand, with the crowd filling in close behind, serenading them beautifully. Well, you would think they'd be happy, but no. They were scowling, especially the girl. She was fuming. Her face was a contour map of derision and hatred. At Farley, she hurled such a look that if I had been he, I'd have thought about leaving the island. But Farley was still quite distracted. He wasn't aware how distraught we had made this young woman. She watched us until the procession had screened us from view. When we started to follow, attendants came quick and directed us off to one side to a tent set apart from the others. Inside were long tables bedecked with all manner of flowers and bunting and food. There were succulent meats, there was ale, there was cheese, there were fruits unlike any we'd seen. There ensued, well, a frenzy of eating and drinking. Appeasing our hunger was no easy feat, but the fare was delicious and plentiful, both. Before long we were sated. 'Twas then that the king entered there. He arrived without fanfare and called for a strong draught of ale. Then he sat next to Farley and settled himself in. He was eager to learn of the world. It was clear that, although he was king, he had yet to go forth from his isle. He was stuck like a pearl in an oyster. So when he'd a chance to hear stories, adventures and travel and freedom, he listened with wonder and longing. He laughed and he roared with unself-conscious delight. Oh, he yearned to dismiss all his duties and take to the sea. You could tell from the way his attention was rapt. And he called for more stories and songs. So then we were compelled to chime in, and the king, like a child, was enthralled. Well, he stayed for a while, and he talked with us, ate. He enjoyed all our jokes and our laughter and song. But a page boy reminded the king he was late in attending the dance. He'd been gone far too long. He arose and began to depart, but then started. He stopped with a gasp and a look of surprise. In the entrance, a cat that was dear to his heart was contentedly waiting with all-knowing eyes. Silhouetted by sunlight, imperiously calm, the cat sat, looking round with mischievous pleasure. Then lifting its head, it rubbed into the palm of a slender young hand on an elegant arm that belonged to Leah. Now the king was all flustered. He sputtered and said, "My dear Leah, it's not proper for my daughter today when your sister is wed. Well, my dear, to be here with this captain and crew. All the women are dancing or taking their ease in the tents on the strand. Let me take you, my dear. This is no place for you. Come with me, if you please." But his voice was uncertain. His eyes filled with fear. Well, a silence fell over the gathering there, as though something momentous was coming to pass. The king's daughter and he both continued to stare, he at her, she at Farley, who stood all abashed. Well, she held out her hand to good Farley. She smiled, and the king went to speak, but she looked and he stopped. "I will take him with me up and through the defile to the Vision Cliffs. There let the others decide." "Oh, my dear," he began, but his voice died away. Leah's gaze had returned now to Farley, who swayed where he stood, but recovering, reached for her hand. He stood ready to follow her every command. In a moment she led Farley into the sun. No one lifted a hand or a voice as they passed through the entrance. And Farley, he followed all dumb and content as a lamb, with no future, no past. Past the tents and pavilions she led him away. Not a word passed between them. They never looked back. Into woods on a track that wound down through a swale, they hiked on, hand in hand, into shade now grown black. When they'd gone, no one spoke. We were shocked. No one knew what to do. The king's fists were clenched tight. After long and uncomfortable moments, the cat gave a mew and then darted outside. The king turned. "Get along to my daughter's reception. I'll wait on my own." So we left him alone. We went down to the strand, where the new married couple sat high on a throne overlooking the people below on the sand. We looked on from a distance, for as we arrived a procession was starting. It was somber and strange. Coming out of the surf, wearing cat masks, were 5 of the island folk, soaked and bedraggled. Arranging themselves on the sand, they proceeded to dance, with the crowd circling round them and chanting. And then they all turned to the sea, where a raft was advancing from round a far point. With "Yea-hey!" once again they turned back to their circling dance, and it went on so long that we sailors sat down in the dune grasses. After a time, the poor raftsman, all bent and exhausted like one who'd been through a typhoon, tumbled in through the surf. That poor son of a shipwreck could barely hang on as the waves pounded into him, tossing him this way and that, and then flipping his raft clear on top of him. How he pulled through, I'm not sure, but he struggled ashore without aid. Then there followed a pantomimed story we none of us sailors could comprehend. In the end, one cat stayed with the sailor. The others all fled from him, running off into the jungle. I can't say where they went, but the man and the last cat, they did a quick dance. Then the pair of them wound their way up through the men and the women who parted to let them advance to the newlyweds. There at the foot of their throne, the two bowed. But the wife, Shamoli, well, she paid no attention, so Fistral, her husband, alone gave an awkward bow in return. When he bade her attend to the ritual, well, she just glared at him. Oh, it was loathing, contempt. Then she looked to where we were all sitting, we sailors. The air in between us lit up with her hatred. She shook herself free from her husband's embrace and then spat at us. Spat! Then she bolted. She rushed down the stairs of the platform and ran. Several sailors, they laughed at this outrageous brat bounding off like a hare. But we hushed them, and then, it was painful to see. See, the ceremony was all disrupted. The men from the raft and the cat mask, they tried to keep going, but everyone saw it was pointless. The crowd couldn't focus. The groom was beside himself, wretched and weeping, confused, disappointed. At last the groom's father went up and retrieved his poor son. They retreated along with the mother to find out the bride, bring her back if her grieving could somehow be quenched. It was awkward. The others who stayed on the beach didn't know, should they stay, should they go? And we sailors, we sat there unsure what to do. For myself, well, I stared out to sea. Like the rest of the sailors, I wondered what had become of Farley. It was all like a dream. They walked down by a stream, and the wide, marshy valley sloped up into woods. As it narrowed, the valley turned into a seam between cliffs, atop which hanging vines made a hood. It was almost as though they had entered a cave, except fireflies danced in the overhung shade. Farley paused, all distracted, but Leah, she gave him her hand, and she told him to be unafraid. The path pinched at the end, then came out at a crack in a cliff. On a long shelf of rock was a chair like a cairn, just a jumble of rocks in a stack like a seat with a back. It looked out into air. There were mists swirling round. Preternatural light from below made the scene seem a shadowy show, a set for a play. But the cliff, well, the height was disorientating. Those mists all aglow. Leah led Farley over slick rock near the edge to the chair, where she sat him, then settled beside. Now the seat, it was massive, but still they were wedged close together, and Farley, he felt, well, he sighed. He looked down past the spray of fine flowers that grew at the base of the chair, and he gasped at the view. Farley fought with a vertigo deep in his soul, for the world seemed all formless, and something had stolen away from his heart. Or no, something had entered it, in through a rend he'd not known it possessed. And the warmth in the hand that he held in his own was an anchor. So as the whole world, it just faded away in the mists, Farley was not alone. Then the shock. All at once there was sharp alculade passing quickly between them, a torrent of pain, so intense Farley thought he'd black out. It was torment beyond any hurt he had known, and the strain made him reel as he sat, for his heart, it was rent all anew, and it burned. But the pain, it was pleasure as well. It was joining them, one to the other. This alculade braid turned their pain into joy beyond measure. There were mists drifting lazily past, and the two lonesome figures that sat on that bench made of stones seemed serene. But within they were changing, as through them the alculade played over sinew and bone, transforming them there into metaphor, making them one. When an hour had passed and the evening was nigh, Farley lifted her hand to his lips and acknowledged the change with a kiss. He looked into her eyes, and he knew he would never return to the sea. She buried her face in the folds of his coat and embraced him as shapes in the mist came apart, drifted down to the dark of the chasm, and finally left them alone in the twilight, in silence, one heart. They came down from the cliff hand in hand. Not a word passed between them, but each was content in reciprocal silence. The shadows were gathering. Night birds were hunting for insects. They darted and dipped all around as the couple returned to the tents, where the torches were guttering low. Having waited for hours, the poor king was distraught. He had meant to give Leah a piece of his mind, but so late was the hour, well, his anger had waned so that now all he felt was relief. When he heard them return, the king sprang to his feet, disregarding the meow from the lap-napping cat. He was eager to learn what his daughter had seen in the mists at the cliffs. Well, good Farley and Leah came into the circle of light. There was silence again. Then she lifted her hand with the palm to the stars. The cat, lurking in shadows, meowed and then hissed. But the king, he stepped forward and gently, with sad resignation, examined his daughter's changed hand. The dim ring of a vine now encircled her wrist, climbed its way up the back of her hand, and spread tendrils that wove up her fingers. The leaves were so fine and so beautifully rendered, they could have been real. In the cove of her thumb was a spray of fine flowers, minute but exquisite. Well, Farley looked down, and he found that he too now possessed a tattoo. From his wrist the vine wound up the back of his hand, circled round his 4 fingers like vegetal rings. In the twist of the vine were the same little flowers, but these were all single, not bunched like the ones in the crescent of Leah's fair hand. A strange sense of unease came to Farley at this, but he couldn't assess at the time the full meaning. How could he have known? Well, he couldn't, of course. It was later, when Leah explained it, the truths that the others had grown in those glove-like tattoos. But the king, he could see it. He groaned. He was still frowning down at her living tattoo. "They were there," said the king with a voice that betrayed his emotion. This night, after giving his youngest away, he had thought to rejoice, but instead he looked ready to mourn. Leah met his moist eyes with compassion beyond her few years. "They were there," she replied. "As you see, they beset us and tested our love. Do not frown, shed no tears, for now here we are grown into one." In the stillness that followed, the king turned his head. Leah spoke. "It is sudden to me as to you, but our will not change what is done. And the world is not broken. Oh, Father, the time is all wrong, and I'm sorry for that, but such things are not ours to control. How he came, when he came, be it chance or some star, does it matter? He's here, and your daughter is whole. I am whole for the very first time in my life. And the others have blessed us. Is that not enough? I'm your daughter. That never will change. I'm a wife now as well. That it came unexpected, don't rebuff me for that. I'm your flesh, and I always will be." The king's shoulders were shaking, his eyes still cast down. Lift your eyes, for I want you to see your new son. He is worthy and true, and your frown is unkind." Leah's voice had grown hard, and the king slowly raised up his head. There were tears in his eyes, but a smile had joined them. "Your voice has the ring of your mother. She kept me in line. She was wise, as are you." Here he raised up his eyes to the star-blasted skies, and his lips fell apart. Leah lifted his hand to her lips, and she kissed his vine scar. His hand, too, was tattooed. He had been to the cliff. He'd been given the gift. And now Farley perceived that the vine on his own hand was part of a much larger plant that connected... How many?
I grieve alongside you, said Leah. But, Father, the touch of my mother is with us in this. Do not mourn at this change. Be not sad, celebrate. It's the way of the world.
But her father rejoined, In the morning you'll realize all that this means. You are playing with forces beyond your control.
As did you.
There was silence between them once more. But the tension gave way, and the king drew his daughter into an embrace. For long moments he held her, but then he stepped back and looked into her eyes with a love beyond words. When your mother and I, he began, came back down from the cliffs, we were shocked to discover her parents were not... It was not in their plan that the others would give the tattoo to their daughter and me. When they saw that the vine only circled 4 fingers, her father was so far distraught that I thought he would kill me. Oh, he went berserk. But in time he resigned himself. Fate has her way after all, and our curses and tears can't prevent the events that are destined to be. I should say that I'm happy. In time I will be. Be content that this too is the way of the world. You have 3 ringlet vines where your mother had 4. There is no greater pain than the loss of a child. I can see you believe in this man, and I know that I owe you the welcome and joy I had hoped for when I was the one newly marked. And I'll try. I will try. All his words seemed to cause him great pain. In reply, Leah held him again. Farley looked to one side and tried not to intrude. Overwhelmed with emotion, confused by so many things outside his ken, Farley knew he was out of his depth. He'd no notion of what the tattoos of the vines meant. And when Leah spoke of these others she'd seen at the cliff, well, poor Farley had only seen mists. Leah turned with her father to face him. The king said, Well, if you are meant for my daughter, then let us return and present you. Our people are already gathered. I'm sure they'll delight when they hear that this night both my daughters are honored and wed. I am fathered again. I will call you my son. And despite his misgivings, he took Farley's hand and he shook it. Then, with great awkwardness, he embraced the young man with one arm. Leah laughed. And the king, with a look of embarrassment, turned on his heels and began to walk down toward the beach. Farley looked then at Leah, his wife. In her face, in her beautiful face, he could read all the things that he hoped she could see in himself, all the hope and the fear at the haste of it all, but the certainty, too, and the love. His emotions in tangles, he took Leah's hand and they followed the king, and the stars wheeled above as they made their way down to the crowd on the strand. That was part 1 of the true history of the pirate Farley, with a factual account of the disappearance of his cat-rigged boat. I probably should have chosen a shorter title, but I was trying to choose a title that our narrator would have chosen, and he's kind of a wordy guy, so that's what I did. It was written and voiced and edited by me, Dawson Nichols. Recorded at my good friend Jim Horn's house, where he's got a nice studio. I hope you enjoyed it. Please listen to part 2, and then part 3. There's only 3. Oh, yes, copyright 2020, all rights reserved. Thanks for listening.